We've been talking about avant-gardes in different countries. We've been looking at America's response to the new technology. We've looked at Spain, Belgium, England, Austria, and now we're going to look at Germany. And in many ways, Germany is one of the most interesting places because second to England, Germany was the most industrialized country in Europe, and therefore most vexed by the provocation of what do you do with new materials, and also the question of how do you design for industry. And that's a really interesting question because we've seen a couple of responses to how design can help economies grow. For example, we saw the artists' colony in Darmstadt, the Mathildenhof colony, for which the secession architect Josef Olbrich built the complex and the exhibition building and so forth. And the idea of Archduke Ernst Ludwig was, if we have better design, we'll be able to sell our products at a higher price. But it's kind of crazy because if you have Peter Behrens blowing glass, how much money is, Darmstadt going to make out of that? Instead, if you think about getting artists to actually design for industry, design prototypes for industry, then the products of the factories can be of the same high design quality as products of artisans. So a group was formed in Germany called the Deutsche Werkbund. This is it. There's a poster for the Deutsche Werkbund, which just basically means the German Werkbund. It's kind of unfortunate that it just means Werkbund. But it's a collective of artists and designers with the aim of making prototypes. And a lot of this was state-sponsored. For example, this guy, Hermann Muthesius, was sent by the government of Germany to go and figure out why England was making better progress than they were on the industrial front. And he looked at factories, he looked at industrial products, but what particularly struck him as important was the whole issue of housing. That while in Germany, factory workers were being horribly underhoused, there are statistics that say between 11 and 20 people to a room of factory workers. And you would say, how can you get that many people in a room? And the answer is you have different sleeping shifts. You have, 6 people sleeping at night, 6 people sleeping from morning until late afternoon, 6 people sleeping in the afternoon, and so forth. So you keep cycling people through the housing. Muthesius went and looked at the English house and began to see that if some of the efforts of architects and designers and some of the profits of factories went toward creating better housing, then in fact the productivity would go up and the profits would go up. So Muthesius came back from England writing a book called The English House, which really is a kind of hymn to the arts and crafts movement. He looks at all of these arts and crafts houses. He's particularly struck by this guy, CFA Voisey, who gives you an arts and crafts planning sensibility, but in a really stripped down fashion. Getting rid of the ornament, getting rid of the handicraft, and instead replacing things with industrial sash windows, industrially made railings, and so forth. So you get an aesthetic that is a bit more severe than we would have seen in, say, Macintosh or Philip Webb. And these are the kinds of things that factories could produce if, in fact, you had designers thinking about what the objects of factory production would be. And they're sort of fabulous. These are electric tea kettles. Another important voice in the German Werkbund was a Belgian guy called Henri van de Velde. And van de Velde, as a Belgian, comes from a culture where Art Nouveau is flourishing. And he brings with him this interest in personal expression, individualization, and the eccentric object. Van de Velde is put in charge of a school, a newly formed school in Weimar on arts and crafts, where, like the Glasgow School of Art, the idea would be train people how to design, and then we will move to the forefront. So this means that at the very beginning of the Werkbund, there is this thing called Schism in the Werkbund. This is a favorite phrase for students throughout the years. Say it out loud, Schism in the Werkbund. It's right up there with Gesamtkunstwerk as funny things that come out of this class. If you're ever taking the GRE and the word schism comes up, you won't forget it, because schism means a division, a rift, a strong separation. And in the case of the Werkbund, the schism in the Werkbund has to do with standardization promoted by people like Muthesius, and individualization promoted by people like van der Velde. So on the camp of standardization, there's this really strong engagement with designing for industry and establishing a norm, which is an interesting idea. We don't even think about it now because we know that if we go to Home Depot, we can get bricks that have a certain dimension, and the dimension of the brick corresponds to the dimension of the cinder block, and the dimension of the block corresponds to the dimension of plywood. There is a kind of norm, a kind of standard measure of building materials that we can rely on, and it makes design efficient. But that certainly wasn't the case in the early decades of the 20th century. So establishing a norm, making prototypes, making these maquettes for industrial production, and tending to do so by relying more on simple volumes and geometry than applied ornament. And of course, on the other side of that, you have the group of people represented by, let's say, van der Velde and Adolf Bene, another member of the Werkbund, who are very interested in individualization. That this Ruskinian idea of the touch of the artist's hand, the particularity of an object that represents incredible labor and effort is still interesting. And also this other kind of weird thing that begins to creep in. And you might say, right here within the Werkbund, there is this kind of dialectic percolating. You know, the Muthesius camp is hyper-rational, you might even say classical, relying on geometry and measure and process and formula. And the other people are interested in expression, kind of resisting the idea that everything can be quantified and insisting on the fact that there is something unquantifiable, that there is this kind of romantic genius spirit out there, and that what the artist can do, what the designer can do, that no industry can do, is sort of tap in to the unseeable, the soul of the world. And therefore, these eccentric forms come forth as a way that the artist or the designer makes these things visible. So things are about to blow up. You can tell this is van der Velde with his wife in a house he designed. And this is an example of the kind of furniture that van der Velde would have designed. Very Art Nouveau-y in the kind of graceful curves, but more simplified. You don't have quite so many curlicues as you would find in Horta or in Guimard. But you still have something that is certainly not a prototype, certainly not mass-producible. And we saw this cartoon before, which is all about the schism in the Werkbund, where van der Velde proposes an individualistic chair, Muthesius proposes a prototype for a chair, and the carpenter makes a chair to sit on. Hilarious cartoon about van der Velde's apartment. The Werkbund really comes into its own when Peter Behrens is brought in to become the designer for a great company called the AEG, Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, which basically means General Electric in Germany, not related to our General Electric. We last saw Peter Behrens at the artist colony in Darmstadt, where he was still very much in the Art Nouveau camp and still considered to be a painter and a maker of decorative arts. This kind of playful pattern making of curlicues is straight out of the Art Nouveau playbook. Behrens was charged with the task of designing his own house in Darmstadt, and with that, he began to develop this stronger connection toward architecture and toward the design of industrial objects and useful objects, and also an attitude toward simplification. Although with that, there's a continuing motif that we see in his work, and that motif is the motif of the crystal. You see it here on this bookbinding for Thus Spake Zarathustra. You see it here on his piano. You see it here on his silverware. If you happen to be one of these Werkbund guys, you're buying into total work of art. You're buying into Gesamtkunstwerk with the idea that suddenly total work of art becomes affordable because these exquisite objects can be produced in an industrial sense and not simply handicrafted. So the early work that Behrens does tends to play with this consolidation of form, moving away from the fussiness of form toward simpler volumes. This is an early building, a crematorium in Delstem. And you can see that he's really close to the language of the Romanesque Proto-Renaissance. This is San Miniato al Monte in Florence, where pattern is applied to a surface. It's a nice kind of intersection between, let's say, a Semperian attitude toward wall as textile, which holds pattern, and a historical prototype. And there are a lot of these early Behrens' works that similarly build off of these fairly severe, symmetrical, almost Beaux-Arts plans, but with a strongly different attitude toward the wall. But when Behrens comes into AEG, Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, he's suddenly working with engineers. And when you're working with engineers, I think it would have been intoxicating if you're struggling with form. What do you do? How do you design? And you think you're making huge strides because you're looking at Romanesque works in Florence. You might think, maybe Romanesque Florence is not the way forward. Maybe these engineers have an idea. So this is the logo that Behrens comes up with for AEG. And it's, variation on the theme of crystal that we've been seeing. This was the logo for AEG before Behrens got there. So holy smokes, this attitude about clarifying form, this attitude toward a kind of graphic design based on geometry and strong pattern is clearly here, although I much prefer this. This is an allegorical figure of electricity on a winged wheel representing the power of industry, holding up not a torch, but a light bulb. It's really as good as design gets. It's too bad Behrens came up with this later on. But this is also a comparison of products. Before Behrens, this was the advertisement in 1898 for a lighting display. All of this kind of curlicue stuff. You just know what it looks like because, quite frankly, your grandmother has these light fixtures all over her house. Or if not your grandmother, then your great-grandmother. This is what Behrens comes up with. Behrens is really interested in a kind of tough functionalist attitude about what the design is. These are simple metal cylinders with reflecting plates and light bulbs. He's stripped it down to the bare bones. He's clarified the geometry to their essentials. And so the products take on this radically new look. And again, this is the door from Peter Behrens' house in Darmstadt, which already has this kind of incipient crystalline motif, and we see it here again. Just some graphics that Behrens did for AEG. If you guys could do this, you would win contests at the Knowlton School, because you'd be a good designer. And he did all kinds of things, not simply light fixtures, but also dental drills, fans, boats, really beautiful stuff. And look how simple these light fixtures are. They're really amazing. It's the age of Gesamtkunstwerk, so Behrens is not just designing things for industrial production, he's also designing housing for the workers, he's designing housing for the factory owners, he's designing factories. And his most famous building is this one. This is the turbine factory in Berlin, on Hüttenstraße, in Berlin-Moabit. And if you look at this, you would have to say part of it seems radical and part of it seems conservative. And when I say part of it seems radical, I mean there's an attitude about glazing that's extreme. Along the front, there's this giant, here, maybe you see it better here, giant glazed surface. Along the side, there's an I-beam, a big chunk of steel, and I-beams all along the side that open up the entire side wall toward an expanse of glass. At the same time, the form is strangely familiar. Kind of looks like a barn. And you think about the displaced rural people who are populating the factories in Germany. They used to have barns. It must be kind of nice seeing an image that connects in some way. It also kind of looks like a temple. If you think about Acropolis type temple, big pediment, columns along the side. And that's elevating work. It's saying work is not drudgery, work is honorable. It also looks slightly Egyptian, like a pair of pylons. So a lot of different images are being collected here. But the thing that's really driving the design is an attitude about this kind of Werkbund functional response. Form follows function. This is how the building worked back when it was still functioning. This is it with nothing in it anymore. There was a big gantry that slid along tracks along the side, because giant engines are being made here. So in order to move the engines, the building itself is equipped with this kind of mechanical moving system. Because of that, you get these really eccentric loads on the building. If the engine is in one place, part of the building is being stressed. if the engine is in another place, a different part of the building is being stressed. The design idea that Behrens brought to this was to make the building flexible, to make it as flexible as possible so that it could accept these different loading conditions. The important thing to look at here is the joint condition of how the building engages the ground. There's nothing here about a classical architecture. You might look at the facade and say it looks vaguely Egyptian, it looks vaguely like a temple. But when we look at this joint connection, it's a hinge, it's a pin, so that the building can move based on these differential loads. It's also a great idea. It's a three-hinged structure. And this is something that would have been easy to solve without using really complicated equations. So in part, the structure is perfectly fitted for its task, and in part, it provides an environment that Mutesius would have looked at when he went to England to spy on the English factories and come back with, saying, you know, a little bit of natural light would help these people be more productive and would increase profits. So these are just some details. I love this rounded corner. I love this kind of elegant kind of streamlining of the horizontal that you get against the vertical. A lot of this stuff is pure design, and a lot of this stuff is pure engineering. For example, this joint, this pin joint that we looked at in this section, or the way that the I-beam and the window framing with these pin joints all plug in. So Behrens' office was an interesting place. He did lots and lots of these factories and lots of designs, and he had to hire a lot of people because he was just churning stuff out. So if you are a successful architect in the early decades of the 20th century, you're going to try to hire some talent. So these were people that he hired. I can't tell who's who, but this photograph claims to show you a group of apprentices in Behrens' studio in 1910. And in the group you have Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, and Walter Gropius, all working there. So that must have been amazing. I mean, think about studio. You sit at your desk and you just throw out crazy ideas to the person next to you. Like, what if I made a building out of cheese? That way we could feed the world and house them at the same time. That's a good idea. I know the way you guys think. That's a really good idea. Or what if instead of having buildings have structure, we could just put wings on them? And you wouldn't have to buy a piece of land, they could fly around the world. That's the way you guys think. But these guys were in the culture of a Werkbund studio, thinking about design for industry, thinking about standardization, thinking about a rational way to build, thinking about a way to build connected to engineering and discarding the nostalgia of tradition. And so you got a kind of interesting kit of architects coming out of there, Gropius, Mies, and Corbu. Just a couple more of the factory buildings. A lot of these, of course, were destroyed during the war. But you see there's this kind of, even here where the volume of the building doesn't mandate temple-like structure. There's this reference to the temple. There's this image to make factory work seem honorific. German Embassy, St. Petersburg, horrible. They came together in 1914 to show the world what Germany could do. This is kind of a response to, say, what England did in 1851 with the International Exposition that gave us the Crystal Palace. We are England, we are industrialized, this is what we have. So the German Werkbund exposition in 1914 in Cologne was this great showpiece of the state of culture in Germany. Huge thing. And of course you look at the site plan and you say, wow, very kind of neoclassical site plan. But scattered around on this neoclassical site plan were some buildings by avant-garde architects. We have over here Van de Velde doing a model theater, thinking about what a theater could be. Kind of still a new building type, not that new, but newish. And here, Bruno Taut making a pavilion to the glass industry. And over here, Walter Gropius, you may call him Walter, but no. Walter White took that name away from him. Walter Gropius and Adolf Meyer, and pretty much Hitler took that Adolf name away from him, making a model factory. And this is kind of interesting. So you come here and you see what can go on. This is, in fact, the way they advertised it. Nothing about the model factory, everything about the Central Beer Restaurant, the postcard from the time. We'll look at the buildings in a moment, but I just want to backtrack and emphasize a kind of subtext that's going on against this push toward industrialization. And we already got a hint of it when we talked about the schism in the Werkbund, hyper-rational versus hyper-spiritual. And the spirituality The idea of expressing the world soul, or finding a way that the artist and the designer could see past mere appearances and represent something more powerful and more truthful, connects to 19th century, early 20th century movements in these kinds of New Agey religions, specifically theosophy. And in theosophy, there was a valorization of abstraction, geometry, and color. And these things were not simply intellectual games, but they were really thought to be ways that cut to the quick and represented things about the world that couldn't simply be seen. This is Madame Blavatsky with Prince Ouspensky, great leaders of the movement. And what they're suggesting is that artists have this rare talent, and that is seeing the soul of the world, and then making images of it and representing it so that other people who are not so gifted can have this vision. Think about the state of what art is in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Art, figuration, painting, somehow has to combat photography. And how's it going to do that? Photography is so good at making an image. Painting is so bad at making an image. Even the best painting doesn't have the indexical quality of registering a moment in time authentically, the way photography can. And this is pre-Photoshop, of course, but if you had a photograph of something, you would have said, this happened there. Painting couldn't do that. So what could painters do? What could artists do? And the idea would be they can see beyond that. In T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, he has a little chunk in there about Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyant. He's talking about Madame Blavatsky there. Theosophy is the new rock and roll. I don't know. The internet has all kinds of pictures. This is what real theosophists look like, so don't be tempted by these kids down here. The aim of the Theosophical Society was to reconcile all religions, sects, and nations under a common system of ethics based on eternal verite. So even if you look at this symbol here, you have like the circle being a Platonic symbol of the cosmos, turned into a snake, being some kind of little Egyptian symbol of continuity, with this little Navajo symbol or Buddhist symbol twisting around, with a Solomonic star, Jewish symbol, with the Ankh, Egyptian symbol, which is also a cross, Christian symbol. The idea of theosophy was to take the truths of all religions, condense them into one series of absolute truths. And one way to prove what those truths were was to look to nature. So you have theosophists looking to nature, but looking at it in a very different way, say, than the Art Nouveau architects, or even Gaudi. Those guys are looking at nature for a formal repertoire of elements that could be decorative or that could offer structure. Here, the theosophists are looking for truth, truthful formal organizations that are windows into the soul of the world. And these are some images from publications in theosophical journals. These are sections through the stems of plants. And if you find the formal organization that nature herself gives, well, that's a good one. That's truthful. You can't quibble about style when nature gives it to you. These are formal organizations that you get if you have iron filings with magnets underneath them. The iron filings will self-organize based on the polarity, and you get these patterns, which are, on some occasions, similar to these patterns. So there must be something so truthful. These are ideas that the theosophists have. There's a book called Flatland by one of the theosophists. And the idea of flatland is really sort of an expansion on Plato's allegory of the cave that we talked about last time. Plato says, we don't know anything about the world. What we know about the world is shadows projected on a wall, and we would be blinded by the truth. So everything we know that we perceive with our senses is a flattened out version of this real truth that we don't have access to. The Flatland proposes this kind of love story on a flat surface, and that one creature in Flatland dares to jump into the third dimension and is ridiculed and made fun of, and so forth. And so, of course, the proposal here is that there is, in fact, a fourth dimension that we can't see, that we don't know about. But when we see it, or perhaps the artists can see it, that will be as much of a revelation as the creature from Flatland jumping into the third dimension. And why wouldn't that be true? Why wouldn't that be true at a period of time when physics is beginning to authorize the fourth dimension of time? You know, E equals mc squared Whoa, that's way over my head. I can't even begin to tell you what that means. But it has something to do about a relationship between space and time. That time is a dimension that needs to be considered, and that's the fourth dimension, the unfolding of things in time. I have to say that when I took physics in college, my physics teacher said that he had a colleague who claimed with complete seriousness that he could visualize up to 6 dimensions. I don't believe him. But he was a serious physics professor at a serious university. Who knows? These are more forms that were illustrated in the ambit of the Theosophists. These are kind of natural forms, protozoa and fungi, again showing the self-organization of nature as a model for how design could work if it stripped away its prejudices. And of course, another thing the Theosophists insist upon was this knowledge beyond appearance, the idea of the aura. For example, can you all see my aura? I have a very strong aura. If you can't see my aura, you are spiritually impoverished. I see these dark clouds over all of you. My aura is glowing in pink. Another way to get at this truth beyond appearance was to kind of deliberately remove yourself from your rational being and do things like automatic writing or automatic drawing. Have you guys ever done this? Automatic writing is fun. I used to do this in college. You just sort of start writing stuff, and then like 6 hours later, there's like all this paper stained with tears because it's so hard to be an undergraduate. And so this is one of these images, all about the gesture. This is another German example of automatic writing, and you have to say it ended badly, right? A poet that these guys were strongly influenced by, or a writer, was this guy called Paul Scherbart. And he wrote a book called Glass Architecture, wildly popular, not simply among theosophists, but also among young architects. The kids in Peter Barron's office were awfully interested in this. If you look at this book, Ulrich Conrad's Programs and Manifestos of 20th Century Architecture, there's a chunk of it in there, and it says things like, how great glass is. Our culture is a product of our architecture. To improve our culture, we need better architecture, an architecture of glass. Clad the earth in colorful glass jewelry, and people will be happier. Exploit iron construction. Buildings can be any shape. They can have any surface. You can make buildings transportable. This is this stuff like cheese architecture that we were talking about before, but based on glass. And Bruno Taut was strongly influenced by this, so that when he got the commission for the 1914 Cologne exhibition to design a pavilion for the glass industry, he pushed himself in a different direction than he did in these earlier pavilions at earlier expositions for iron or for steel, and began to go back to this very strong image in the ambit of theosophy and in the whole cult of the crystal, and that is the crystal itself. This is the glass pavilion that Taut built in 1914. It's too bad this thing got torn down immediately afterwards because World War I was breaking out, and there's a certain amount of metal and material in here that could be turned into cannonballs or grape shot or whatever kinds of munitions were being used. So it doesn't exist anymore, but this thing would have been polychromatic. It would have been glowing and colorful, and it would have been showing you different kinds of glass that could be used at the time. Really looks like some kind of thing erupting out of the earth, doesn't it? The way it sits on its plinth. And its cornice is inscribed with these pithy sayings about glass coming from Scherbart's glass architecture. It's an exhibition pavilion, so the idea is you come in one direction and then you come out in another direction so that the crowds can keep cycling through. And here's how you would experience it. And I think this must have been beautiful. There were these shells of walls, and they were all made of glass block. So you could kind of see movement beside you, but in a distorted way. You're moving up, somebody else is moving down. There's this kind of dynamism inside the core of the crystal. Look at how the stairs are made with glass block risers, so that light is filtering through this. And when you get to the dome, you have all of this colored glass pouring light through. Here's a skylight bringing light into the core of the whole thing. Fabulous. And the way down from this is to walk beside this, iridescent, colorful, glazed tile with glass ceiling waterfall. Magnificent. So that's glass, but that is not really Werkbund expressing itself in its hyper-rational way. If there is a schism in the Werkbund, the glass pavilion by Bruno Taut represents a kind of expressionist moment in a Werkbund sensibility, using the material of glass to express something not simply about the production of glass, but about the spiritual value of transparency and crystal. Also working at the Werkbund exposition of 1914 was an architect whose name you probably know, Walter Gropius. Mr. Gropius here. Here he is, looking dapper with his little bow tie. Do you know why architects wear bow ties? See, you guys are never going to have to wear bow ties. This is so sad. It's to keep your necktie from dripping in the ink when you're drawing. So you'll still see the old guys, like, say, Peter Eisenman always wears a bow tie, so that his necktie doesn't drip in the ink or drag through the graphite. But you guys can wear whatever you want. You should wear those black turtlenecks like Steve Jobs. That's the look for computers. Or little gray hoodies. That's the new look. Van de Velde did his pavilion for the Werkbund Theater, which is a kind of droopy Art Nouveau-y thing. I think it has very little interest, quite frankly. But this is what Gropius and Adolf Meyer did, a model factory. And this is pretty interesting. It takes the idea of the crystal. It takes the idea of transparency. It takes a lot of these, save the world through glass and transparency notions that come out of Scherbart's writing, but instead applies them to a different sensibility, this kind of rational, functionalist-driven sensibility, and you get the model factory. And there are certain things that are going on in the model factory that I think are important, and that is the attack on the corner. In some way, you look at the main facade of this, and this is kind of like a pylon. This is the kind of thing that a guy working in Peter Behrens' studio would come up with. A big patterned rectangle with a central entrance, pylon-like and severe. But look what happens at the corner. At the very place where, say, Peter Behrens' corners at the AEG in Berlin became extra heavy, these corners become extra light. I think this is a really interesting photograph showing you the model factory to the left and what the rest of the Werkbund exposition looked like. So all this kind of Beaux-Arts classicism out the wazoo. But this thing is really quite radical. Not only do you have the radical idea about the corner and this very dematerialized stairway, but you also have this radical idea about the skin. And you might say this is a better read on Semper's notion of the four elements than the stuff that was coming out of the Wagner school, or even out of Peter Behrens' own work. Because here, the wall is really a curtain, a glass curtain hung from a structural frame. And to emphasize the separation, they are in fact separated. There's a slot of space between the structural system, which is pushed beyond, and the skin, which is pushed outward and can become seamless and transparent, like a big old ice cube. Fabulous, Mr. Gropius. So here's the date, 1914. Interesting things are happening in Germany in terms of architecture, but all of that takes a second place when it comes to the fact that a war breaks out. The war to end all wars, luckily, World War I. And architecture grinds to a halt. Nothing is going to be built during the period of war. All the resources of the country, all the energy of the country will go toward preparing and waging war. And 1914 to 1918 are more or less the period of the war. And here's Gropius, always looking great. So handsome, Alma Mahler fell in love with him in his soldier uniform. This was a terrible war. The war casualties are extraordinary. Estimates say 9 million combatants were killed. It depends on which estimates you read, I have to say. That German estimates will give you one set of figures, English estimates will give you another set of figures, French estimates will give you another set of figures, but it was a horrible, horrible war. On the left we see the Battle of Somme, on the right we see the Battle of Verdun, and these are some of the casualty numbers. At Somme, 77,000 people were engaged, 24,000 casualties. 31% of the people at Somme didn't make it out. Kind of amazing. And they gained almost nothing. You have these trenches. People are throwing poisonous gas at you while you're in a trench. You perhaps know about this because you watch documentaries on World War I, like Downton Abbey. This is Matthew fighting who knows where. It's just a movie, no place really. And the fabulous country house of Downton Abbey being turned into a hospital, which in fact is what happened to a lot of these country houses. And this is a real photograph. And here we see a cemetery from the Battle of Verdun, which lasted for 299 days. People gaining maybe 4 inches one day at the cost of thousands of lives, and then moving back 6 inches the next day at the cost of thousands of lives. So these are a set of estimates that come from really the best source I could find, which is, of course, Wikipedia. 750,000 Franco-German casualties, of whom 542,000 were French. Ugh. But let's get back to happier times. The exposition in Cologne was not the only exposition that the Werkbund mounted. They had another one in Breslau, which is now in Poland, and goes by the name of Wrocław. I'm told that's how it's pronounced. Wrocław, Breslau, Poland. And I think this is really an amazing building. This is the Centennial Hall, called the Jahrhunderthalle. It's spelled wrong here. Look at it in the next slide. But what it is this kind of exhibition hall that is a tour de force of concrete frame. This is kind of in league with Gaudi, really, of somebody rethinking the structural properties from ground zero. But I think what's interesting about it is you kind of get the sense of crystal, right? You kind of get, if you look at the plan, the image of one of these crystals, you get the crystalline structure of it, but done by using this material in an incredibly specific and an incredibly elegant way. So that when you get to the period after the war, you have people continuing to go for that look, and you get something like this, the Große Schauspielhaus by Hans Pelzig in Berlin, where really it's a big vault, and the crystalline stuff is just kind of hung, like Rococo. Pelzig, by the way, did movie sets for Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. If you know this movie, it's a great expressionist movie. The world is topsy-turvy because the somnambulance is walking around manipulated by Dr. Caligari, who has amazing powers. The period after World War I was a kind of amazing period in Germany on a lot of different fronts. Culturally, it was amazing because, in a sense, the old guard had been overturned. The kind of conservative people who had brought Germany into World War I had been pushed aside. You had a new regime, the Weimar Republic, which was a left-leaning regime, strongly supportive of the arts, with this kind of crazy culture. This is Marlene Dietrich, who lived to be 91 years old, which seems great until you look at Leni Riefenstahl, who lived to be 101 years old. So these divas of the Weimar Republic went on forever and ever and ever. The movie Cabaret, starring Lucille Ostero, also known as Liza Minnelli, is a retelling of the kind of cabaret life of the Weimar Republic. And the art scene was really quite extraordinary too. These are some paintings done in this period. George Gross, homage to Oscar Panizza. I have no idea who he was. Woman Slayer, I know what that's all about. There's a lot of violence. Violence in the subject matter, but also violence in the kind of acrid colored paints, or the fragmented representations of the figure, or the monstrous faces, the architecture collapsing on itself, this kind of energy and disquietude and, well, let's say expression or expressionism really governs a lot of this work. Some of it has to do with the kind of culture we're in. This is Max Beckmann representing the cabaret culture, nude dancing, oh la la, very decadent. Prostitute culture represented by Otto Dix, but not simply representing prostitutes, but representing the kind of monstrous juxtaposition between fancy lady in her furs and prostitutes and beggar man with amputated limbs who suffered during the war. All these differences coexist. All these impossibilities happen. I did show this at the beginning of the class. That's Josephine Baker. I Googled cabaret life in Berlin, and up came Josephine Baker. You can't watch too much of that, though. But there was a very avant-garde group called the Arbeitsrat für Kunst. And the Arbeitsrat für Kunst were a group of artists aimed at promoting the arts. So the arts were enshrined at the very core of the Weimar Republic. These were very kind of, see the hammer? There's a sickle in there somewhere. The hammer and the triangle. So these guys are sort of left-leaning. But the Weimar Republic economically was a mess because war reparations were being demanded by the Allied powers, so that the economy of Germany was terrible. The whole Ruhr Valley is the factory area that really was the economic engine of Germany. It was being occupied by the French and the English, so that any goods that were produced could go to France and England to pay war reparations. So political extremism was going on, both on the left and on the right. Here we see Hitler in 1932. He became leader of the National Socialist Party in 1921. He attempted a coup d'etat in 1923, and by 1933, he was sworn as chancellor. So this period of experimentation, this period of sponsorship for the arts, this period that really moved forward the avant-garde was quite short-lived. And here at the bottom you see a group of kind of left-leaning people. The Spartacist uprising in Berlin is a little battle between the two fronts. And it was pathetic. You had like the workers striking from the factory with like rakes, and the remnants of the German army with tanks just mowing them down. So hyperinflation is something that really characterizes the Weimar Republic, and is probably even a better indication than the Spartacist rebellion of how dire the times were, and how strong the contrast between the haves and the have-nots were. This is a chart showing you the value of the German mark and how it changed between 1919 and 1923. You can see it's logarithmically losing value, so that by November 1923, an American dollar was worth, I can't even say that number, a bunch of marks. And here's a man wallpapering his house with German marks. The money has no value. All of the real goods are being taken out of the country to pay war reparations, and so money just keeps getting printed with nothing to back the money. Here's a woman patching a hole in her house with money. These are children. They can't afford toys, but luckily they can stack up money and make themselves a little tower. So soup kitchens, all this stuff, really bad for architecture, really good for theory, it turns out. That in periods when you cannot build anything, what are the architects going to do? And the answer is the architects will theorize. The architects will invent that building out of cheese that we were admiring so much. Or think even more profoundly to ways that society could be restructured to create a new architecture. One of the few things that got built during this period was an observation tower called the Einstein Tower by Erich Mendelsohn. This is Erich Mendelsohn. And Mendelsohn was a soldier in World War I, kind of like all these architects, and had the experience of being gassed in the trenches. But unlike most of the people who were gassed in the trenches, he kept a sketchbook. And this is a great idea if you want some really killer sketches. Go get yourself some mustard gas and start sketching. And who knows how he did these sketches. But he had lots and lots of sketchbooks that he produced during this period of these very dynamic, visionary kinds of architecture. I think they're so interesting because they're kind of a hybrid between geological architecture, or a kind of organic architecture erupting from the earth, and a mechanical architecture, like steamships, plowing through the terrain. And in fact, he got to build one, the Einstein Tower in Potsdam, which perhaps you guys know. It is kind of great looking, right? It really does have this idea of something moving forward. To me, this looks like what happens to, like, say, a Cocker Spaniel if it puts its head out the window. Like the ears go back. It's going so fast, the ears go back. And that's what seems to be happening here. There's a kind of distortion. The skin of the building is pulling away because it's plowing. It's moving so fast through the prairie. Wow. Because this is pretty much the Einstein Tower. Look at the way it engages the ground. It is this kind of thing erupting up. There is a plinth, in fact, with windows embedded in it. The windows give into the laboratory space below. And inside, there is an observation tower with a solar telescope. I got into this once. It's very hard to get into, but I had a Fulbright fellowship to East Germany, communist East Germany, before the Iron Curtain came down. And they told me, no photographs. This is very important equipment. Very serious research is being done here. You couldn't possibly photograph. And I was thinking, really? That's it? That's all you got? A tower from the 1920s? I think our government doesn't need this knowledge, but I'd be really interested in photographing it. Yeah, but I couldn't. But the bottom part looks like a kind of really elegant ship with kind of varnished mahoganies and all of that kind of stuff. And then there is this freestanding metal tower. And the reason it's a freestanding tower is that the thermal expansion of the masonry shell is different than the thermal expansion of the metal tower. Do you know what I mean by thermal expansion? When the sun heats something up, it expands and contracts, and different materials do that at different rates. So since it's important to keep the telescope focused, you couldn't have the difference between these two systems working on it, because this was the best thing they had in terms of knowing about the universe in the 1980s, back when I looked at it. Hilarious. Anyhow, it's pretty great. Seems like it must be concrete, right? Look at that thing. It would have to be. It seems like it's all about the plasticity and the malleability of surface. But this is Germany in 1920. And Germany in 1920 did not have raw materials. They did not have steel. All the steel was being pulled out to pay war reparations. Even the number of brickyards was, taken down to like 25% of what it was before World War I. But this is a brick building. The way you get this very modern-looking brick building is you get masons chiseling bricks to look like dog ears in the wind, and then you cover it over with stucco. But it's a great-looking thing, and it's really rare because it's one of the, there it is, one of the few things that got built during that period. Mostly, architects speculated. Mostly, architects dreamt about this new kind of architecture, this new kind of society. And in fact, there was a series of letters that went between the architects, these kids from Peter Barron's office and other architects, where they would just extol the value of crystals. And they would have nicknames for themselves. They would call themselves like Twinkle or Shiny or Sparky or Transparent. These were serious architects, people like Sharoon, people like Lookout, people like Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius and Hans Sharoon. Mies's nickname, by the way, was Proportion. He's not messing around with Twinkle for him, no. This image by Lionel Feininger of a cathedral is typical of the kind of images being produced by this group of architects so interested in the crystal. I think it's interesting for a number of reasons. One, the crystal is reforming architecture as something more dematerialized, more fragmented, more fused with its ground, more part of its atmosphere. At the same time, it's a woodcut. And a woodcut would have been a way of making an image, let's say, in the medieval period. So at once there's this kind of forward-looking in terms of what the architecture will be, and backward-looking in terms of connecting to an older craft, connecting to something that hasn't been so contaminated by war as industry had been. Here's Hans Lookout, who grew to be a extreme functionalist architect, making a crystal. And this is an example of one of those letters. I think this is so good. This is by Bruno Taut. This is a building that can fly. See, I wasn't kidding about, wouldn't it be great if buildings could get wings, and if they get tired of being at one place, they could just take off and fly somewhere else? This is just another one all about like loving the stars. You think crystals are good on Earth? Wait till you get to the stars. Their crystals are amazing. So all of these kinds of weird forms. And over here, I showed you this image that the Theosophists were looking at about strange organic forms. So not simply crystals, but other strange organic forms are being examined. These are ideas about sort of crystalline penis towers. Great looking. Or here, these kinds of eruptions of crystalline forms coming out of the earth by Hans Sharoon, interesting architect. Everybody's doing it, including our friend Walter Gropius. You got to say, Gropius, no way, say it ain't so. But we already saw that he was interested in an attitude about transparency. We saw it in the model factory. This is even before the model factory. This is the Fagas shoe factory in Alfeld, Germany, where he's attacking the corner with the vigor of Frank Lloyd Wright. He's making this beautiful curtain wall. And here he is. We saw this picture before, but now I'll tell you what he's doing. He's leaning against his project for the Chicago Tribune Tower competition in 1922. Now, 1922 was the year of no work in Germany. The inflation, the hyperinflation, is almost at its peak. So yes, we're going to speculate about architecture. This project is not Gropius. I don't remember who it is, but this one is Gropius. Really, he's turned this thing into a crystal box with a few horizontal terraces cutting into it. This was the winning competition entry. It's fabulous. It's a beautiful building, Howells and Hood's Tribune Tower competition. But my God, they're living in a different world, right? I mean, the kinds of abstraction, the kinds of clarification of form, the attitude about material, the attitude about history going on in Gropius is very avant-garde. That is to say, there is no history. There is geometry, there is material, there is structure. And this is, ooh, let's make it kind of Gothic-y at the top. Let's get these kind of big verticals so that it's like a tower, but it's also Gothic. And let's get an arched window down at the bottom. Don't get me wrong, I think Howells and Hood's tower is beautiful, but they are playing a different game. The second prize competition is pretty great. This is Elio Saarinen, a Finnish architect, who I think really came up with a nice project because it deals with a simplification of form that we got in the Gropius project, but still maybe a more conventional and decorous attitude about how the building plugs into the city. These are just more competition entries. The ones I want to show you are these. Here's our old friend Adolf Loos. This is his competition entry. Oh my God, that's funny, Loos. Simultaneously he makes a phallic symbol, as if to say, that's what these towers are all about, and he makes it out of a Doric column. Hilarious. And this is also interesting, Bruno Taut's entry for the Tribune Tower competition, which in fact is a big crystalline thing. With not such a good skin, I have to say, but the idea is big crystalline thing. What a Gropius house is looking like in 1920, which I think is pretty interesting. Oh my God, Gropius got a commission. He's building something. That's great, because nobody's building anything. He's building the Sommerfeld house in Berlin, and it is a house that in some ways is a traditional house. It is a wooden house, no new technology there. It has a kind of big German roof on it, although interestingly enough, when Gropius photographs it, he hurls himself onto the ground and gets a worm's eye view. So the roof looks more like a Frank Lloyd Wright roof and less like this big, stacky German roof. This is the canonic photograph, looking right in. This is the uncanonic photograph, looking like, Grandma Frieda's house in Germany. But the detail is crystalline. The detail pulls on motifs from the cult of the crystal. So lots of these little fragmented triangular things, particularly when you go inside. The wooden paneling is very agitated. And the stained glass also plays on these motifs. Gropius did a project for another house. This one didn't get built, Haus Kallenbach. But you can see the whole site plan is back when people had drafting boards and adjustable triangles or 45-degree triangles. Everybody did a project that looked like this because you're so pleased with your ability to make a 45-degree angle that you just do it relentlessly. And that's what this sort of looks like. But it's an interesting project because the language of the house has been really stripped away. All of these references to conventional German farmhouses that we still see in the Sommerfeld house here have been replaced by cubic volumes that intersect with one another in a differential way. And here's a house by Peter Eisenman, House 3, which basically is the Kallenbach house of two geometries crashing into each other, configured as simple stripped-down white box. And the same is true of this monument that Gropius and Meyer built called the Märzgefallene Denkmal. Would you all like to try to say that one out loud? Märzgefallene Denkmal. What it means is memorial for the March heroes of 1921. A group of these left-wing people were mowed down by the right-wing people, And Gropius built this monument. The original was torn down and then rebuilt by the communists. So there's something there that looks like it, but it's not the real thing. I think this is a really interesting monument because it proposes a different kind of monument than, say, an obelisk, which is all about marking a point, or a different kind of monument than a pyramid, which is all about marking a point. It takes the idea of point, but it structures it in a dynamic relationship with its landscape. So in many ways, it's kind of the dialectic of something starting out earthbound and normal, gaining energy and pulling forward, moving forward, and doing so in this crystalline fashion. This is a photograph of the original, and this is what it looks like now in Weimar. Kind of great, actually. I did mention that we had a couple of these serious guys. This is Proportion, Mies van der Rohe. And his way of dealing with this language of the crystal is exemplified in projects for skyscrapers that he made for Berlin, the Friedrichstraße skyscraper competition. He did 2 projects, and they're both really, really amazing for a lot of reasons. One, this is the plan, and that's a great idea, right? You think about the diagonally patterned wooden paneling that Gropius had in the Sommerfeld house, and you have to say that's pathetic, Gropius. But you think about this kind of fragmented plan extruded upward, it really does become a kind of crystal, not because of its profile, but because of its skin and because of the way the facets reflect back onto themselves. Look at the attitude about solving the question of the tall building, which we last discussed in Chicago. When we looked at the Chicago skyscrapers, we said base, middle, top. You have people like Richardson suggesting it could be a palazzo, and Sullivan saying it can be stretched as a palazzo. Mies says it doesn't have to be a palazzo, it can be a crystal. And so the thing just slams into the sky and slams into the ground plane. And it also has this radically indifferent attitude toward the context of the city. Kind of like Frank Lloyd Wright plopping the Guggenheim onto Fifth Avenue. This thing dwarfs the petit bourgeois scale and life around it and proposes something new. This is an elevation, in case you wondered how it met the ground or met the sky. Doesn't do it. And these are attitudes to how it would look. Just transparent, barely there, and fragmented. Mies's second proposal for a Friedrichstraße skyscraper tower, I think, is even more radical. Because in spite of the fact that this thing behaves differently than anything we'd seen by 1920, 1921, it still has an attitude about the core that's kind of conventional. And that is the core, the elevators, the services, the stairs are in the center, and the building splays out in an equal way around it. Although I have to say, this is kind of interesting. These cuts bring light into the core in a way that would not happen in a conventional tower. Here, Mies migrates the core to the perimeter. And instead of having the tower be sharply faceted, it looks like he's looking at a different natural system, kind of like an amoeba in the process of cell division, or some kind of cell undergoing meiosis or mitosis, or whichever one divides like this. So again, you get light into the core, you get these 2 cores instead of 1, and this very irregular perimeter all around it, all glazed and fabulous. So I think let's take a little break and we'll come back, because we have tons of stuff to talk about.